St. Paul, Minnesota, which is, you may or may not know, is just the city right next door to this one that I'm in, Minneapolis. So yeah, I'm from here and I've lived here my whole life.
What was your first camera?
First camera was a Canon XL1, which is a sort of a boring industrial camera before cameras got cool, let's say, before the digital cameras got cool. But I learned a lot on that. It was sort of a professional camera to use, even if the image wasn't great. So it was actually a good tool that I didn't really realize at the time. I went to film school when I was about 30 years old, right when sort of the DSLR sort of revolution began, you could say, when like the Canon 5D came out. And I bought a Canon 7D when I went to film school. So that was kind of the first camera I actually owned. And you know, you could make what we thought at the time were cinematic images with it.
Right.
And you could change the lenses, and it offered shallow depth of field depending on the aperture you were shooting on and everything. So yeah, that was the first camera I personally owned, and I thought it was just an awesome tool to learn on. And the image was like head and shoulders above what I could get my hands on before that. So even though they look kind of awful now, it was really cool at the time. So technology is changed a lot. It's kind of subtle in the way that it has changed, but it's just basically nudged the quality closer to film, ironically, that it's sort of coming full circle and trying to emulate film.
I've already only seen the first Wrong Turn. How important was it to stay true to the original's roots and also gear it for today's audience?
Yeah, good question. You know, there was zero intention to recreate the original film's tone, the roots. Once I read the script, I realized that it wasn't important at all to retain anything almost at all from the original films, because the studio and the screenwriter were so clearly trying to reimagine it, go in a completely different direction. So it didn't really make sense to try to pull anything from the previous films, whether that was references, style of shooting. Obviously the characters are completely different, the threat is completely different. So it was very sort of liberating in that it was like clean slate, let's start over and find a new voice for this. There were actually some more character names in the film that harkened back to the original that were changed in the final cut of the film. Jen was Jess previously, so that got changed actually in post-production. But yeah, Scott carried through. So that's a good point, that those names did survive in throughout production, and then just one of them made it to the final film. But
what should not be rebooted?
I don't think. I think the sequels went quite far, maybe outside of the original vision, but the first film is still so strong, and I think new horror fans are still going to find a lot to enjoy about that. And I can already feel myself cringing a little bit by all the references they'd be throwing in and redoing scenes exactly the way they were. And so
Mike P. Nelson and you have always wanted to do a project together. What made you guys really say, wow, this is it, this is what we want to do?
Sure. You know, a couple things. One is just we've been trying to make a feature together for a long time. So to be honest with you, like any opportunity was going to be interesting to do that. Any opportunity to make a feature with a real budget and, you know, there was a real project was going to be interesting. But I think we were both so floored by the script of the reboot for Wrong Turn that we were really interested and saw so much potential. So exciting. The script was just, especially to just read it for the first time, was like just so batshit crazy. You were like, oh my God, this is wild. This is like unpredictable. It's subverting people's expectations. It's sort of addressing the stereotypes that we throw at each other and the way we sort of boil each other down to these sort of one-dimensional people. So yeah, it was a combination of just really wanting the opportunity to work together in that capacity, but also that the script was just thrilling to read and that we were really excited. There was nothing about the idea of shooting that script that wasn't really exciting. We've been friends. We've known each other for about 11 years now. So I met him when I was just towards the end of film school. He was out of film school for a couple of years,
Mhm.
and fortunately, a mutual acquaintance of ours put us together on a project, and then we became friends and collaborators at that point. So it still feels like a really long time from that point, several years, maybe 5-6 years ago, when I think we both felt like we could make a feature film, like we had the skills and wouldn't make a mess of it, to this point. Just felt like a long road for sure.
What are your inspirations? Genres, people, directors? What really made you, want to do this?
Genre wise, I am I enjoy a lot of genres. I love sci-fi. I love horror. I like um, films in those genres that can show a little bit of restraint with not necessarily spoon feeding the
Right.
viewer. I think, as just about everybody, I enjoyed films from childhood. I I started to, as I got into my 20s and 30s, start to realize that I was like starting to discern what choices worked in films and what didn't. So I started to kind of enjoy as a viewer, but also start to be able to break down like, oh, that editing was just off, and that's why this scene isn't working, or why it might start off as a feeling of like, why do I feel this way looking at that, and then think about it and go, oh, because it's just sort of lit poorly and it just looks sort of tacky or something. Um, uh, I would say probably the film that like knocked me upside the head the most at the beginning of my sort of love of movies was probably Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is a Spielberg film and is just
Mhm.
like visually unreal and has this crazy story and it's obviously a sci-fi film that almost sort of dips its toe into horror a little bit early on in the film. Um, uh, has ridiculously cool visual effects for the time. So I think if I had to point to a movie that sort of like shook me, it was probably that, um, because it just captured so many fascinating things at one time that I was interested in. But yeah, I think as a fan and as a filmmaker, I do love sci-fi. I do love horror. I like sci-fi horror. I like the kind of horror that scares me the most is the type that is typically of the supernatural variety, and
Yeah.
sometimes that can border into sci-fi. Just that kind of unknown, can't be known,
Right.
can't be
Sort of
escaped.
mystery, right?
I would say in the more present time, Denis Villeneuve is probably a director that I am compelled with the most. I think his track record is just spectacular, and obviously he's getting to do like some of the greatest sci-fi movies that have come out in the last few years.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah.
Awesome. What's it like working during COVID?
Uh, Thankfully, we didn't make Wrong Turn during COVID.
Right.
It was the end of last year, sorry, the end of 2019.
Mhm.
Um, However, I shoot commercials for a living as well,
Right.
and I would say it's challenging and a little bit tense because of the inherent risk. But every time I'm on a job and I'm feeling sort of exhausted from the PPE and everything else, I just think about the healthcare workers that are like grinding that out every day, and they're at so much higher risk than I am that over the last year of working in those kind of conditions, I just have to keep reminding myself that like, yeah, this mask is uncomfortable and this face shield's
Right.
uncomfortable, but it's just it's a pretty minimal hassle compared to what so many people are dealing with. So I've heard from people that have worked on features throughout COVID that it's a totally different beast. They wouldn't recommend it. um, uh, Discussions about working together, they're like, great, yes, let's do it. Let's wait till COVID's done, because they seem to find making a feature in COVID such a hard task.
Mhm.
Which I can imagine. Where I live, it's kind of a small commercial market.
Mhm.
So like the jobs and stuff aren't like union jobs. But I can imagine that on a feature, a TV show where there's such a detailed protocol that needs to be in place for production that it probably is really difficult, especially when you're in the technician side. And so yeah, it hasn't been terrible for me, but it's still a different world for sure when you're just seeing people like this.
Right. Could you survive a real life wrong turn? Be honest.
I guess I'd like to think I'm a survivor. If I got the chance to join the foundation or be killed, I would sign up.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, compared to having your eyes burned out and your tongue burned out and your ears cauterized and thrown in a hole,
true.
yeah, I probably would. That doesn't mean I wouldn't maybe be biding my time like Jen does, but that said, if I didn't get the chance and I was just out in the woods and they were hunting me, I don't know. It's their land, so I'm not sure I would make it out of there.
Does Jennifer have a second sight? There was a lot of like supernatural elements to that too. Like you see flashbacks in her brain, and she's like, it was a lot of different mystery there. Do you think she had sort of like a second sight going on, or?
That's a really interesting question. There's nothing in the script that alludes to that or anything, but I think it's a fascinating thing to think about. It's not something that really came to my mind as we were making it or anything like that, but I love the idea that there could be a supernatural thread in Wrong Turn. I love sort of secondary genres that can kind of hide under the radar in what seems like a sort of a slasher horror flick.
You ever go into writing? Because actually you're really not just creative behind the camera, but you seem to have like a good thought process when it comes to the characters and the scenes. And do you think you'd ever write any of this, your own little worlds?
I certainly have thought about it. And obviously in film school, you go through some of that process.
Right.
I can only talk in reference to my own experience, but like, for example, collaborating with Mike, and we don't collaborate in writing, but we collaborate in, all parts of the production process, pre-pro and everything, and love to sort of build off each other's ideas and stuff like that. I do like the idea of being a co-writer, because I feel like my collaborative energy just sort of builds and builds and builds with other people. Whereas when I'm working as an individual, especially on the page, that's sort of unexplored territory for me, especially in long form storytelling. So I like the idea of co-writing, because I think with the right partner, there would be a ton of potential, and it would just sort of keep growing and being more energetic and coming up with better and better content. I thought about this question, and I think if I were to point to somebody working now, it would again be Dennis Villeneuve. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. I think he's sort of both an outlier, but obviously making big blockbuster films at the same time, but they're always a little bit sort of left field, a little bit. I mean, obviously like Dune is a huge property,
right,
sort of
right.
Arguably an unfilmable one, but I'm curious to see what he can do with it, because I think if anybody could sort of pull all that complexity into just the much more sort of atmospheric experience of a film, it could be really cool. But I would probably say him, because I just think he's playing in these really fascinating realms, and has a really cool voice that's very sort of nuanced and kind of restrained. He's always holding back a little bit, which I really like, because I feel like the viewer can do so much work on their own if you just give them a little bit, sharing what he needs to share, knowing that you, the viewer, are going to put so many pieces together and sort of just keep building that world in your own mind, so I appreciate that. There's so many facets to that, but I'll start with the most boring one. The camera that you're using is a factor in that, for sure. And here's a thought that's sort of my perspective, is that we're not necessarily trying to make things look real. We're trying to give them a look and a style that is compelling and cinematic. And in my mind, a cinematic image isn't a realistic looking image necessarily. It's taking you into a world that's sort of, how would I put this? A world that's reflecting whatever that director wants to show, but it's not necessarily hyper realism that wants to be shown. I will say that, like, the camera we shot this on, the Arri Alexa Mini, is probably the best camera out there that will give you just a great looking image, like right out of the camera, kind of what you wish your camera would do.
Right.
So that's a part of it. The resources and the talent that does get put into color grading in post-production is pretty significant. And so not only are they starting with a great quality image, I'm not saying that because I shot it, but just the camera produces a really
right
high quality image with a lot of information to work with. And then they have these great studios and stuff with a bunch of experience to bring to bear. One interesting thing about this movie is, because of COVID, I actually wasn't able to personally color grade the film, which I was really looking forward to, because it's obviously, as a cinematographer, part of the whole process. You know, it would have been 10 days, 14 days on the West Coast doing that. But because of COVID, I had to look at the reels of the film here. Mike was allowed to go out there, but only be in the color grading suite for like 2 days. And everything else was like remote. So that was disappointing. I'm not disappointed with the final outcome.
Right.
But because of the nature of only being able to look at reels back home, I really just had to focus on what I knew I could affect, which was like any significant problems, and know that any of the nuanced details and all the little nudging around that we could do, I just had to like know that Mike was gonna have his eyes on that. And we discussed, general approaches we wanted to take and shared references and stuff like that beforehand. But really, what I had to do was just focus on like, hey, this is a problem. This is a problem.
Right.
I'd like to do this here, and then know that all the little details just it would have only slowed down the process for me to try to push that into their world at that point. So
right. Yeah, because it's like, your baby. This is your big project. So
yeah, exactly. So yeah, disappointing to not have the experience, but happy with how it turned out, and was really happy that we were still able to get the right kind of communication going, so that it was done the way we Mike and myself wanted it to be done. So that was great. And I never got to meet the color grading artist, but they did a fantastic job. It's kind of interesting. We seasonally we shot like late summer into early fall, so it was like this transition period. Like the last day of shooting, like everything was dry and fragile and sort of about to fall out of the trees and everything. But we were attacked by ground wasps a couple different times on that movie. At one point, there's a scene in the film where they were actually right where they take the wrong turn. They sort of decide to go down this rocky crevasse. And we were shooting down in that area with Matthew Modine, and we wrapped that, and everybody had to walk up, but they had to walk through right up that narrow crevasse. So it was a single file thing, and there happened to be these almost invisible like ground wasp hives, like right there, right at the foot of that. And of course, somebody walked by and woke it up. And then suddenly they're just swarming, and people are trying to run up, but they can only go single file. And Matthew Modine somehow like just walked past all of it and like was oblivious to it, and kind of came out the top. He's like, what's happening? What's wrong?
Yeah, well, what are you guys all doing?
There's people flailing and running, and some people got stung like quite bad, like maybe a dozen times, kind of a thing.
Wow.
So there was a little bit of a health risk at one point. Everybody turned out to be okay, but then those ground wasps, I hope I'm naming them correctly, reared their head again at night. Oof. Which is even worse because you can't even see where they are. But at that point, the grip and electric team that had to work around them was a pretty well-oiled machine. So they were like sort of cordoned off an area, and
Right.
but yeah, the wasps were the killer in this one.
Any funny stories from set?
You know, being that it was a year ago now, it's hard to remember some of those small stories. I mean, Mike and I are always kind of goofing around, and not always, but sort of keeping each other on our toes, I guess you would say. Funny stories though.
Other than Matthew Modine, like completely avoiding the wasp. That's pretty
walking past a wasp apocalypse and just kind of fine.
He has luck.
Yeah. I think he's got an interesting calm about him. I think his energy probably just let him like walk through the fog of wasps, and they were like, this guy's chill. He doesn't care. He's fine. But yeah, otherwise, I honestly can't think of anything that was like a running joke through the film. There was a lot of fun being had. I think the camaraderie was just fantastic. But at the same time, it was super intensive because we just had to move at such a fast pace. Yeah, it was really cool, the effort that crew put in, and just how sort of enthusiastic people were. Even 2-3 weeks into shooting was just really cool to watch.
Yeah, the stunts were insane.
I had shot a little bit of stunt work, but had never really seen a stunt performer just like go all out. And here we were with like 5 or 6 stunt performers, and watching these people hurl themselves down a hillside repeatedly was just incredible. And they were doing it in a deliberate way, but nonetheless, it just had to be falling down a hillside brutally.
Right.
And working with the stunt coordinator on that was just awesome. I learned a ton, but I have so much respect for stunt performers because, like, I mean, they are putting their bodies on the line, and I'm so glad we were able to film it because it ended up in the movie and looked awesome, I thought. And there were some owls going on. There was one stunt performer who was Darius's stunt double, and he was new to it. He was a stunt car driver by trade, and he was moving into this, and he was right there with the other stunt performers who had more experience in this kind of physical work, and watching his eyes after the first hour or so, he's like, this hurts so bad. I can't believe what I'm doing right now. He was a total trooper, but it was kind of cool to see like a veteran who like barely showed any emotion after taking a huge fall. Right. And then somebody who's like on their first day just going, what am I doing?
What project do you want to do but haven't got to yet?
That's such, being this is my first feature film, it's sort of a question I don't even know if I can begin to answer, but like I said before, I do enjoy the sci-fi and horror genres. And that includes, even the comic book stuff to a degree. Right. So I like playing in those worlds, and I think it's because I like the fantastical or the horrifying or the supernatural, because you can still tell very relevant, relatable stories within those. So for me, it's like, why not, tell these compelling, dramatic stories and have this awesome genre setting that it's held within. Yeah, I think honestly, for me, I'm somebody who's driven by a good script, and I think talented, skilled actors are just like a joy to work with and see work. So it honestly, my ambition might even transcend a specific genre, and it's just I want to tell a story, or I want to make a film that I want to see.
Right.
I would say that I'd be interested to work in the sort of the limited series television world. I think that's such a cool format that's obviously, I wouldn't quite say taking over, but not far from that. It might be the sweet spot for narrative, sort of that format where it has an end point. Makes a lot of sense, and I think audiences appreciate that too. We want to have a story end, even if it keeps going in theory or however it ends, but we don't necessarily want to have, 24 episode per season, goes on for 5 years, 10 years. It's just, it's maybe there's still a place for that, and I suppose there is, but I think this self-contained, really strong, complete story is a really good sweet spot.
Or any planned projects you're going to do?
It's a pretty quiet time for me right now, both because of the time of year where this commercial market sort of goes to sleep, like right at about the new year, and then it's just going to start waking up, so to speak. I mean, around March or something like that. I have been talking to Mike, keeping in touch with him. He lives in Minnesota too.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, to understand, what he's striving towards and everything else. Again, being that it's my first feature, I kind of realized this after we made the film that like there's going to have to be this sort of hurry up and wait element to it, of like, nobody knows who you are, you have no resume of making feature films. Until people can see the movie and it gets around, don't expect much to happen. So it's kind of a combination of that, as like an individual cinematographer. I think before I could, for example, work with another director on a feature or a limited series, there's going to have to be some awareness of me. And then on the other side, it's the very important goal for me, which is to keep working with Mike, is to allow him to find that next project, and then see if I'm the right person to shoot it and go from there. It's an okay time for things to be quiet, although I'm sure once we hit May and June, I'm going to be like, all right, let's go.
Yeah.
I have thought about that, much like I've thought about writing. Certainly as a cinematographer in certain commercial, certain types of commercials you end up directing.
Right.
I'm certainly interested in it, but I'm also more specifically just interested in collaborating with people. Mike and I, when we're collaborating, it's not like I'm co-directing, but there's sort of this exchange of ideas that are both pointing in the same direction. So in the practical sense, he's of course directing actors. He's completely in that world, and I'm not intruding in that world. But when we're, shot listing, looking at a script early on in the process, stuff like that, those conversations of like, does this work? Does this need to be changed? Hey, what about this idea? That collaborative flow of information is still going. So I guess I would say, because I'm pretty firmly in this position now, I'm most interested in just looking for good collaboration. Not necessarily to move out of this position, although that might change someday. I guess it's the person that I am. Like, I've been in quite a few bands over the years in my younger life, and I was always the drummer in the band, but I was most concerned about the melodies of the music. So it was sort of like I was in the back holding down the beat, but what I was really thinking about was like these melodies, these harmonies, this songwriting is the most important thing, not me doing any technical drumming. It's like the songs need to be good. So as a cinematographer, it's the same way. It's like I'm focused on the image, I'm focused on the lighting. I need to know the technical aspects of all that, but I really care about the execution of the scene. I care about the story being told well. I care about giving the actors the time they need to do their job, as much time as possible.